It was supposed to be a scenic route, just a shortcut through the woods to save some time. Now, Mark and Jess were hopelessly lost with no signal on their phones and no idea where they were. They had been walking for hours, and every direction looked the same. Every tree, every bush, every leaf, all identical to the last. It was like being trapped inside a green tunnel with no light at the end. They had turned off the main road onto a dirt track, which according to the map should have led them to a quaint little village. But instead of houses, they found themselves surrounded by nothing but trees. And instead of a quaint little village, they found themselves in the middle of nowhere. They didn't know how far they'd walked, but they knew they were lost. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows around them that seemed to stretch and distort, making the trees look even more menacing. The forest was coming alive with nocturnal sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, each sound sending shivers down their spines. And then they heard something else, a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It sent a primal fear coursing through them, freezing them in their tracks. The growl echoed through the trees, a haunting sound that seemed to carry with it the weight of centuries. Mark pulled Jess closer, his arm a reassuring presence around her shoulder. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. All he could manage was a shaky breath. The growl rumbled again, closer this time, and the branches above them creaked ominously. Something was out there watching them, stalking them. The urgency of their situation crashed over them, and they began to run. They ran blindly, desperately, the undergrowth snagging at their clothes, branches whipping at their faces, but they didn't care. They couldn't stop, not when they didn't know what was behind them, what might be gaining on them. They stumbled over roots, fell into ditches, but quickly scrambled back up, their eyes darting around, searching for an escape, for a sign, for anything that could help them. But the forest offered no respite. It was a labyrinth of green, a living, breathing entity that seemed determined to keep them trapped. As they ran, Mark and Jess could hear the sound of their own ragged breaths, their pounding feet on the forest floor. But above that, they could still hear the growl, now closer, more guttural, like a predator readying itself to strike. They burst out of the trees and into a small clearing. In the distance, they saw a faint glimmer of light, a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. With renewed determination, they surged forward, the promise of escape spurring them on. But as they drew nearer, the light seemed to dance and flicker, teasing them with its familiarity, only to retreat further into the impenetrable darkness. They raced across the clearing, their eyes fixed on the light, their hearts pounding with anticipation. And then the forest seemed to close in around them again, enveloping them in its cool, damp embrace. The trees pressed in, their branches forming a dense canopy overhead that blotted out the sky. The growl was right behind them now, and they could feel the hot, fetid breath of the creature on their necks. With a surge of adrenaline, they pushed on, desperate to escape the clutches of the relentless forest and the terrifying creature that stalked them. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs screamed for mercy. Then suddenly, Mark stopped, his eyes wide with disbelief. In front of them, rising out of the undergrowth like a mirage, was a wall. It wasn't tall, maybe 4 or 5 feet high, but it was solid, made of rough-hewn stones that looked like they'd been placed there centuries ago. They were trapped. They had been running in circles without realizing it, and the forest, or something in it, wanted to make sure they knew it. The growl had stopped. Silence descended on the forest, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the frantic beating of their hearts. Jess sank to the ground, her back sliding down the wall. She slid to the floor and huddled on the cold earth, burying her face in her hands. She felt exposed, vulnerable, utterly defeated. How could they get out? Was this the end? Were they going to die here, lost in this ancient forest with no way out? She looked up at Mark, his face pale, his eyes filled with a fear she had never seen in them before. He shook his head slightly, as if coming out of a trance, and slowly stood up. There had to be a way out. Mark scanned the area, his eyes sharp and focused. The forest was a maze, yes, but mazes had solutions. This place was different. It was a trap, a carefully laid trap that had ensnared them without their knowledge. He turned back to Jess, kneeling beside her. "We need to find a way out," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. "I'm sure there's an exit somewhere." They explored the perimeter of the clearing, but the wall was unbroken. It was clear that whatever force had brought them here wanted them to stay. But why? And what force was strong enough to manipulate an entire forest? As they walked, Jess noticed something strange. A pattern of small pebbles arranged in a circle around the base of one of the trees. It was subtle, but something about it nagged at her memory. She recalled an old folktale her grandmother used to tell her about druids and their sacred groves. About how the druids had a deep connection with nature and could control animals and even the weather to some extent. Could this clearing be part of an ancient ritual site? Had they stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to find? Suddenly, the air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. Jess felt a chill run down her spine. The forest was reacting to their presence, and not in a friendly way. A large branch snapped overhead, showering them with leaves and twigs. And then, to their horror, they saw it. A dark shape was descending from the canopy, gliding silently towards them. It was massive, like a giant bird, with leathery wings that spanned the width of the clearing. Its eyes, two glowing embers in the gloom, fixed on them with an unnerving intensity. In that moment, they understood. They weren't lost in a forest. They were lost in a prison. And the forest itself was watching, waiting, and now it was angry. Terror choked Jess's scream as the creature swooped lower, its shadow engulfing them like a shroud. It landed on the ground, its massive form blocking the meager light from the sky. Its eyes, burning like molten gold, seemed to pierce their souls. But it wasn't alone. More shapes were emerging from the trees, taking flight, circling above them, their eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. They were trapped in a nightmare, hunted by creatures that seemed straight out of legend. One of the creatures let out a piercing screech that tore through the silence of the forest. It was a challenge, a declaration of war. And the forest, it seemed, was on the creature's side. With a sense of foreboding, Mark reached for the knife in his pocket. It was a small, flimsy thing, but it was all he had. Against these creatures, he felt like David facing Goliath. The creatures advanced, their eyes never leaving Mark and Jess. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and their weapons were useless. There was no escape, no chance of survival. Or so they thought. As the creatures closed in, ready to deliver the killing blow, Jess noticed something strange. They weren't attacking. They were curious, almost hesitant. It was as if they were waiting for something, watching something. Just as suddenly as they had appeared, the creatures stopped their advance. They shifted, murmuring among themselves in strange guttural voices. Their attention was drawn to the sky. Even the great bird with the golden eyes was looking upwards. Then, as if responding to some unseen cue, the creatures took flight, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. The forest was silent once more, the only sound the beating of Mark and Jess's hearts. They were alone in the clearing, the creatures gone. Jess and Mark stared at each other, their faces pale in the gloom. They had survived the night, but what did it mean? Why had the creatures come? Why had they spared them? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. The forest held its secrets close, and for now, Mark and Jess had no way of knowing what those secrets were. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the canopy, they emerged from the forest, blinking against the brightness. They were outside, back in the world they knew, or at least thought they knew, but something had changed. The forest had changed them. They were no longer the carefree couple who had taken a wrong turn that day. They were forever marked by their experience, forever changed by the forest and its ancient guardians.